Well, it's 3:15, so I think we should get started. Good afternoon, history buffs. Thank you for joining us for a stroll down memory lane back to planning in the 1960s and 1970s. My name is Larry Mintier. I'm a planning consultant, one time an OPR employee, and along with... I sure can. Okay, I'll lean into it. Along with Steve Preston, we are the two co-historians for the California chapter of the American Planning Association. So the idea for this session really started with a comment. I guess maybe Julia, you were there in the room at that time, and the question was, well, we're coming up to the 40th anniversary of the urban strategy, and we ought to somehow commemorate that. But that rapidly evolved into a larger discussion about, yeah, well, what about those decades of the 60s and 70s and what was going on? And because they really were notable, those 2 decades were really notable for these big planning concepts and really ambitious schemes. These schemes that we're talking about are all state level, so they're not local general plans, okay? That's what we're talking about today, are state level planning. Well, you'll understand more about this as we get into it. But the schemes and proposals were geographically inclusive. They were statewide. They weren't like the Coastal Act or BCDC, right? They were statewide. They were topically inclusive, and they dealt with land use and circulation and infrastructure and natural resources. So some dealt with education, some in fact dealt with health. So they were broad in terms of their topical coverage. And they all sought to define appropriate roles for state and local government in terms of shaping the future. No, it's not state, I say state and local, state, regional, and local government, and trying to come up with a good plan for how you allocate responsibilities among them for shaping the future of California. And at this point, let me introduce the panel members. First is Steve Preston. Again, he's my co-chair for history in California Chapter APA. He's city manager of San Gabriel, and prior to joining San Gabriel, he served as a planner in Laverne and Glendale. He's been a long member of ICMA, as it would befit a city manager, and he's contributed a chapter on management to ICMA's most recent volume on community planning. He's also authored a chapter in the anthology Planning Los Angeles, issued by the Cal Press, or the APA Press, rather. And most recently, Steve received the APA President's Award for Outstanding Leadership in the planning movement. And more recently, I guess in the spring issue of JAPA, he co-authored an article on comparing the ethical requirements for AICP and ICMA. Bill Fulton, who you know from his California days, he's living now in Houston, and we're grateful that he could escape the flooding to be here today. But he's the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. He's former planning director, former mayor of Ventura and director of planning and economic development for the city of San Diego. So there's a prior. He also served as vice president for Smart Growth America. He was a principal in PlaceWorks planning firm. And he's been a senior fellow. I don't know whether you still are, Bill, a senior fellow at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC. And he's the founding editor and publisher of California Planning and Development Report, which we've read for years, and is author of 5 books, including The Guide to California Planning, which is being reissued in an updated version. Our third panelist is David Booher, and David's had a long career doing many different things in the public and private sector as a planner, lobbyist, scholar, teacher, consultant. Most recently, he's been associated with the Center for Collaborative Policy, and he's an author of many articles and is co-author with Judith Innes, who's here today, of Planning with Complexity, an Introduction to Collaborative Rationality for Public Policy. And the second edition of that book will soon be released. Dave was Cal Chapter APA president back in 1979, 1980, and he was the founder of the California Planning Roundtable about the same time. So, let's get on to it. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about the 60s and 70s, but I want to start with some deep background that goes back about 100 years. And by the way, I've got a timeline that has essentially the same information. Could you pass copies of that around? There are more people here than there are copies, but it's basically the same thing you're going to see on the screen. It is not the PowerPoint itself, but and I've got copies of all these reports that we'll be talking about. So, before the 1960s, in this period that we're going to be focusing on, for 50 years, there was an ongoing effort to define the role of state government and local government, again, in managing the future of the state of California. And it began as far back as 1913 with Governor Hiram Johnson's 1913 Commission of Immigration and Housing. That's not a typo. Commission of Immigration and Housing. And then every few years there was a new idea for how to deal with those issues, and for 50 years or so, there were a whole succession of these commissions and departments, and they didn't last long, and they didn't produce a whole lot. And that carried on right through the 1950s.